Our last session on the session number one for ILA is intentional teaching. And we may ask the question, well, what's different in intentional teaching than just teaching? Why we use the word intentional? And that word intentional can be applied anywhere where there's a more in-depth analysis. We're not just doing things haphazardly. We're not just changing if we feel like we need to change or want to change. We're following the data. We implement a new activity. We see if that increased learning. If we didn't get the kind of increases we wanted, we fine-tune and adjust it. We adapt and improvise to make it more effective. And that's where the skills develop. But there's absolutely not a better professional development for faculty than trying new strategies in the classroom. Doesn't require a skill to do that, but it does require the courage to try something new. That skill will be developed as we then fine tune the activity to become more effective. So just as our past videos, a lot of memes in these that send a really good message. It talks about, and basically in this, the change pattern. How do we change? We like pruning a bush. We take a bush, we prune off the dead growth, and all of a sudden we get a flurry of new growth in there. And it's the same for our courses. Sometimes it's the same for us. But we have to understand there are 5 natural phases of grief. When you say grief, you could say change, improvement, resistance, all saying the same thing. You hear all this about buy-in. Well, we have to get more buy-in. Buy-in is the 5th stage. So we don't need more buy-in. What we need is to work folks through these phases at a much quicker pace, especially the first page. The denial phase, there's nothing productive about that. Matter of fact, it undermines our mission and vision, because the denial phase is a phase where things I used to use that may have been a primary paradigm back in the day for higher education that no longer apply in the 21st century. So now they sound more like excuses. So if I've been able to use these excuses and never been challenged, if I've been able to hold on to old paradigms and have never been challenged, then how am I supposed to break out of denial? Once I've been challenged on those, and then I realize these excuses aren't working, that usually gets us into the next phase of anger. So at least the good thing about the anger phase, we're no longer in the first phase. We're making progress. We have to celebrate the positive here. We're making progress. So when we hit the anger phase, that's usually the venting phase. We're really mad that the excuses are no longer working. Because once I can't use excuses, then I have to accept responsibility, which gets us into the third phase. Now that acceptance of responsibility is usually a conditional thing. Well, what about if I just change one or two things? I don't have to really change all 5 of them, do I? So it's that bargaining phase. But at least if in the bargaining phase, you're almost to acceptance. Unfortunately, sometimes after that comes a little bit of a depression. Deciding whether I want to stay in this game and commit to the mission or just move on. It's a real challenging time, and a lot of encouragement's needed to get through these phases. And that's that depression stage. So I'm realizing my bargaining is not working. I'm either all bought in or not. And the last phase of acceptance, not really the last phase on this slide, is the buy-in. That's what everybody, we just want buy-in. Well, I can guarantee you, I don't think anybody would go to somebody that was grieving over loss of a loved one, and you would say things like, you just have to accept it. I mean, that would be ridiculous and also insensitive. They have to work through the phases, just like we all do. So we'll help you work through these phases, but what we don't have a high tolerance for is staying in the denial phase. If you're still in the denial phase by the time you finish ILA, it really may be time for a career change for you. Because this buy-in phase is not the last phase. This is a leadership academy, and we've made it clear we're shooting for the maximum, and everything we say, we use the word maximum. So maximum buy-in is ownership. When you get to the ownership phase, that's when the internal accountability exceeds the external accountability. I'm not having to worry about what my institution is going to require from me in terms of evaluating data and coming up with an action plan. I've already got my action plan before we get down to that point. So you're ahead of the curve, so to speak. You don't get caught behind the curve in a panic mode trying to do things that I should have done maybe years ago. So we'll all work through these phases, and we'll all support you as you get through these phases. But the memes will continue to say it better than any. So the perception of what we do is one thing, the reality may be another. Don't you hate it when people say, anybody can teach? Well, what they mean is they're evaluating, maybe the courses they went through. And they're realizing anybody can stand up there and talk about what they're good at and then give a test and grade it. Well, that's true, but that's not teaching. We're talking about a teaching, a coaching, a counseling, an advising, whatever we need to do to get those students from point A to point B, with point B being much higher than point A. So if we were doing this in a group work session, we'd ask, how would you teach a course that was not in your field of study? What resources would you use? And the first thing you think is, why am I teaching a course that's not in my field of study? But point is, what resources would you use? You would have to go somewhere to find those resources. What would be the focus of your teaching for a class of students who are not majoring in your subject matter? And keep in mind, the vast majority of students in gen ed classes are not majoring in that subject matter. So what would be the focus? And quite frankly, the state has already determined that focus. The focus is on communication and critical thinking, the skills that businesses have been screaming about for years that our students are not coming prepared with. So that has to be the commonality, that common focal point. And then we say, what if that course was something like a music appreciation and there weren't any textbooks or class materials? What would you want your students to achieve? And it should be the same whether it's biology, computer, or history. We want to be able to critically think. We want to be able to evaluate information and knowledge. We want to be able to communicate that in a respectful manner, have some conflict resolution. So regardless of the course we teach, those are our common core competencies. So we've kind of answered the question about skills. As Terry O'Banion says, our job is to provide them an education, allow them to make a good living and live a good life. Like these kindergarten bulletin boards. You look at these bulletin boards, it just screams, let's look ahead. Let's strive higher. I mean, right off the bat in kindergarten, all right, where are you going to college? Let's go ahead and be thinking about this. College is not a dream, it's a plan. Once you come up with a plan, it's more intentional. A dream's not intentional. So everything we do, of course, the students are responsible for their learning until we go look in the mirror, and then we're the one responsible for learning. So changing what we do, changing that environment a little bit will allow that student to flourish. Now, what you needed when you were younger, quite frankly, depended probably on your upbringing and how much support you had at home. Keeping in mind some of our students have very little or negligible support at home. And that's why encouragement is so important. Encouragement, probably the most underused word in higher education today. Encouragement. Remind me of my grandson. He was so good at putting together puzzles when he was about 5 or 6 years old that I'd sit beside him and just kind of trash talk him. You can't do that. Let an adult help you. Give me that piece. Let me do it for you. And I'd wait long enough till he could pop that piece into place. And once he did, I'd act so surprised that like I just couldn't believe it. I go, oh, that's just incredible. And he'd just get off on this, the entire puzzle. A couple weeks later, he was staying with us and he asked, did I want to put together a puzzle with him? And I said, well, I'm a little tired tonight. Can you do this one by yourself? I promise you. Next thing he said was, well, can you just sit up here and go, oh, boy, and make these comments? He wanted to get that. He wanted to get that fixed. He wanted to get that encouragement. Now, keep in mind, this encouragement is absolutely crucial during the early phases of learning anything new, any kind of new material, skill, or behavior. And I would think faculty would be a little more empathetic towards this now that we're going through this COVID crisis, and a lot of faculty are having to convert courses that they've not converted before. So they're going through these same crucial phases, and they need encouragement also. We're here to not only see what we can gain from professional development, but what can we provide to others through this process. The question will always be, no matter what the problem is, what are we doing about it? What am I doing about it? That's always the question. If you got frustrations during COVID, I don't understand how to do this or how to do that. Well, who's putting together a brainstorming session? Maybe a Zoom session where you can maybe meet weekly and talk about these concerns and talk about what people have implemented that has worked. So we're all not having to reinvent the wheel. That's something that's all too rare in education, and that's a degree of standardization where we can ensure a minimum amount of course and instructor and institutional variance when it comes to student success. Chick-fil-A says it best. I say a lot of things the best. This one, how you know somebody needs encouragement, they're breathing. That's how you know. So the bottom line here is if we want students to accept more responsibility for their learning, then we must accept more responsibility for providing a course structured enough and supportive enough that they can accept that responsibility. So if we were doing group work today, we'd come up with a one-sentence welcome statement for your LMS. This is something the students see as soon as they open up the LMS to your course. They've not even shown up for class yet, but they see this welcome statement. What is that welcome statement? And then what one word would you use to set the culture in your class? These kind of exercises force us to focus on what's more important. This one gives 17 things teachers do great. You can read through these yourself. I'll flip to the next screen. Pause the video if you need a little more time reading. You'll notice our requirement is for post on article reviews only positive constructive comments allowed, and there's a reason for that, because we are maintaining a positive proactive approach to everything we do. That proactive approach says, what am I doing about it? A negative non-proactive approach says, how can I just continue doing what I'm doing? So we'll talk about issues, we'll talk about problems, but we'll do so in a positive proactive manner. But like that says, being positive in a negative situation is not naive, it's leadership. And that same article continued with the other, what great teachers do. You drop down to that last one. We'll talk a lot about that when we get to neurology of learning, also the power of emotions. The power of emotions. Emotions affect thinking more than thinking affects emotions. So if we're worried about getting students to think and digging a little deeper, we must pay attention to the power of those emotions. And that's what leaders do. We don't wait for it to happen, wish it would happen, we make it happen. Now we'll use this is a group discussion face-to-face. We'll just use it as a discussion. If it was a 5th week of class and you were the division director, student came to you and says, you know what, I've got a teacher that's always late for class and unorganized in the beginning, waste our first, 15, 20 minutes of class. Well, what would be your response to that complaint? Not only what would be your response, what would be your first course of action? Because we all know that anything the student says is gospel, right? So that's the whole point. How do you know that's accurate? You don't. And that's why number 3 bullet here, observe the next class 5 meeting, the next 5 or 6 class meetings. Just see if this is correct. I mean, you just watch outside the door. I had this arise one time, and that was the response. I just kind of noted about 5 or 6 class meetings and found the teacher was about an average of 9 minutes late every day. Every day I looked at it. Now, this was a 3-day-a-week class. So we got to ask ourselves, how many hours would that be over a 15-week term? You're 3 days a week. You're missing 9 minutes each class. That's almost 30 minutes a week, over 7 hours over the course of the semester. And this was in a course. It was an anatomy and physiology course. So it was in one of those courses where the common complaint is we don't have time to cover everything we need to cover. And this particular teacher just threw over 7 hours out the window. And then, of course, that didn't include the additional time it may take to prep when they walk in the door and get things together. So once you've determined that, yeah, that was an accurate statement from the student, what's your next course of action? You actually looked at the data for that teacher, and you found, well, that teacher also has the lowest success rates. Matter of fact, they're the ones that are constantly complaining about not having enough time. So what do you do with this teacher? And as with any conference, of course, you'd call them in and say, hey, what's going on here? Student complained about this, just checking to see and first thing this one said when I met with them was, oh yeah, I had to go back home and get my keys one day and I was late for class. I pulled out my sheet and I said, well, unfortunately, I observed the last 6 class meetings and every single one of them, you were late an average of over 9 minutes. And then immediately her tone changed. She immediately says, where do I need to sign? And then I said, are you going to be able to correct this or do I need to help you out? She said, I can take care of it. Problem solved. Let's move on to the next. We don't flounder around when there's mistakes or problems. We address them. We make sure there's a plan for correcting it, and then we move on. So if you ask what proactive measures a teacher could have taken to prevent this, Well, how about polling the class? How about giving we always suggest giving a little short eval, just a few questions after the first major exam. When we've gone through our whole process, given objectives, we taught the lessons, they performed the activities, and then we tested, went through the entire cycle. Good time to give a little course eval. Maybe these things would come out. Now, as director, are you intentionally teaching, coaching, or leading? And the answer would be, what's the difference? We're doing all of those. What made it intentional was the process we used to confirm that the complaint was correct and then come up with a plan of action to improve. So this involved critical thinking skill, life skill, problem solving, quantitative literacy, communication, self-discipline, conflict resolution, time management. All these things were included in this one issue. So same two questions for any problem that we identify. And that is, what you plan to do. What are you doing about it? Now you may not be doing anything, but that's the question. What am I doing about it? I heard my dad ask me this so many times growing up that I started asking my own self before I went to him, which is exactly what he wanted. He's building those quote unquote leadership skills in his own children. So if you don't know what you're doing, the next question will be, well, what are your fellow instructors doing about this problem? In other words, what are we doing about it if I'm not personally doing anything? And that's the same two questions for any new strategy, activity. How did it expand learning? And number two, how do you know it increased learning? You say, well, it increased test scores. And that can be an indicator. But as we all know from tests, we can memorize our way through tests. That's not necessarily a good indicator of learning. It depends on the test, depends on the assessment. But those are the questions we ask. My wife shared this meme with me a few weeks ago, actually. So our challenge is taking the technology today, that 21st century technology, and combining it with 21st century pedagogy. And we're still, we're challenged to do that across the nation, not just Alabama. We say the typical student pattern is, they take notes, they open the book to problems, they look over equations, turn in the problem, cram for test, take a test, and then forget. So, and you know this because when a student comes in a course, one of the most common comments is, well, who did you have before this course? Who in the world taught you before this one, especially in a subsequent type course? We always ask about who they had before. We can't have that many ineffective teachers running around. That's not the problem. The problem is most teachers use the same format, and that format is not conducive for learning. It is conducive for getting through the test and moving on. So when we say it's all about learning, that requires us to do the same thing as teachers we require students. We tell them this all the time. Quit focusing on the grade, focus on learning, and the grade will come. But we also have to remind our own selves of that. Quit focusing on the grades, focus on learning, the grade will come. Now, that taking notes, that's when we cover the content. The test, that's when we provide the test form. All that stuff in between is up to them in an old, outdated system anyway. In the new system, our main focus in the classroom is that center part of learning. What are we doing other than covering content and testing? And this was I thought, one of the best explanations of what a teacher does. And what I want you to do is drop down to where the question mark is. It says, must take unusual risks even if none of their students resist. Now, I had to stop and think about that a minute. What was it trying to say? And then it was clear. When you start taking risks, when you start trying things new, there'll be somebody that's going to resist. There'll be somebody that doesn't want to do it. Teacher told me one time that she tried those group discussions and students didn't like them. I said, well, what'd you do? She said, well, I'm not doing those anymore. I said, well, whoa, here a minute. You might want to poll them because I bet they don't like final exams, homework. There's probably a bunch of stuff they don't like, but we're not going to throw it out just because they don't like it. We're here to provide what they need, not necessarily what they may want. So our challenge is finding a more effective way to get it done. If we listed the top 3 issues that impede learning, you did that to yourself, the top 3. The next thing you should be able to do is you should be able to list specific strategies, intentional strategies that you've implemented for each of these issues, since they're top issues especially. I can remember the first time we had a department meeting about 20 years ago when we were listing student problems. I was on the board writing. And I remember the first one was attendance. The second one was writing, and I really can't remember the rest of them, but I remember the first one was attendance, because after we got the list on the board, we went back to the first one. We said, all right, what's anybody doing to address this number one issue of attendance? The room was dead silence. So we went to the second one. Well, what's anybody doing to address writing? Dead silence. Till somebody said, I don't know, ask the English department. So you see where the old paradigm was. The old paradigm is, yeah, we know what all these problems are, but it's not our responsibility to address them. Okay, that paradigm has no place in the 21st century community college. And then, of course, after we did this, we discussed with our group how you plan for your class period. Now, if you talk about saving 6 hours a week, I want to know what that 4-hour phrase or that 4-word phrase is, if it's going to save 6 hours a week. And that's, can you help me? Faculty are not real good at this. You know, we don't want to seem like we need help. We're worried about being vulnerable or seeming weak or less than competent. But problem is, if we overemphasize how confused we are, we may unintentionally make ourselves sound unprepared. So keep the request short, clear, and a matter of fact. You know, we talked about the wolves back in the other video on introduction. The strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf. And you don't know why they use wolves. I guess they could have used something else. But it reminded me of the story about the man that he had these two internal wolves that were battling inside him. One was the positive, constructive wolf, and the other was the negative, excuse wolf. And when somebody asked him, well, which wolf is winning the battle? The answer was very clear: the one I feed. The one I feed is the one that's going to win. And that's why mindset's so much more important than skill set. So we keep the request short. I need your help. I've tried these solutions, have not worked. Do you have a suggested course of action? Or I need your expertise. What we don't do is dump a problem in someone's lap and we've not even put the thought into it to even have a possible solution. Now, that's not very respectful to go to someone and just dump a problem in their lap. And here we are, advanced degree professionals, we're going to dump it in their lap and let them worry about it. And we've not even put enough thought to even come up with a possible solution, or Google it, or ask my colleagues. Best way to lead is by example. Actually, it's the only way to lead. So our students, you can see the applications of this for students. And it's not just these particular means. It's just anything that relates to their life and life success. So each class session, we should treat it like a short course. What do you want your students to gain from this particular lesson? It may be an entire class period, or it may just be that one 20-minute session of the class. And then the important, how will this impact their life success? How will it impact their life success? How is it relevant to them and their success? And then what activities are going to be used to promote this? Notice the word activities. It didn't say, what am I going to say to promote it? What are they going to do to promote this goal? And the most important one, how are you going to hook them? You got the first 5 minutes. How are you going to hook them on this particular lesson that it is relevant and it's something they need to know that'll help them in life? How are you going to do that? Just use an example. We talk about quantitative reasoning. That's an important skill. I don't care what class, it don't matter if it's history, it don't matter if it's psychology, I mean what it is, including quantitative reasoning in the course from where some students are so scared to death of numbers, when you just say the word math, they freeze up. How about taking 60 seconds to determine how many ways you could make change for $1 using only nickels, dimes, and quarters? And you need to throw in with students and not Googling the answer. We're working on critical thinking here. And if that's too difficult, you could start off with a simpler one of just dimes and quarters, or just dimes and nickels. Question: what's the first thing that goes through your mind when you see a magic trick? First thing, you can't even help it. Your mind just asks this question. It's a natural response. How'd they do that? How did they do that? And why is that so beneficial to learning? Because once my mind asks a question, it's very intuitive. It has to know an answer. That's why it's so important to create the curiosity. Because see, the cure for boredom is curiosity, but there is no cure for curiosity. One thing just leads to another. So getting that curiosity stimulated is very beneficial to learning because they're asking the questions, as in the students asking the question. How could you replicate that in your classes? You say, well, I can't do a magic trick every day. It doesn't need to be a magic trick. It could be a cool video. It could be a cool meme. It could be a quote. It could be anything that stimulates their curiosity. Could be just asking them a key question. We're in the time of a crisis right now, COVID crisis. Maybe we could ask some questions about how that relates back to the Spanish flu of the early 1900s, or the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, or something to stimulate relevancy. And what would be your first question? If you were told that you'd be providing training and you would be tested on specifics of that training, what would be your first question? Because I know what mine would be. What are those specifics? You tell me what you make it clear what I'm required to know, and I'll feel more in control. What a wonderful way. I guess somebody said our students are having math problems, and the question became, well, what are we doing about it? And this is the kind of results, this kind of innovation you get in a positive, proactive environment.